Hello, Robs. Greetings and salutations. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story by Roberta Roche with Harry De La Roche Jr. and the Murderer. I don't really feel like reading this book, but we're going to do it. Chapter 5, Thanksgiving Vacation. Part 13. By the time I was ready to leave for home on Saturday, November 20th, I had changed the plane tickets my parents had sent for November 24th. But by then I had my choice of flying or driving with another cadet. Pete Salerno, the cadet from the Lutheran group who lived in my area, had heard of my mother's illness, so he offered me a chance to ride home with the guy he was driving with. Pete was going home early since he'd come to the Citadel early for freshman training in the fall. If you can wait till Sunday, Pete promised, I'll see you have a ride. I can also get you a ride back to school if you want to plan on that. I told him no, I have to get home. But then I asked if he could bring my shako and full dress uniform if there was room in the car. I'd be wearing my dress uniform on the plane, but I wanted my parents to see me in my full dress garb. Pete agreed, so before I left for home, I took the uniform to him. He wasn't in his room, however, so I told his roommate about it and put it on Pete's desk. The next day, which happened to be homecoming day, Walt Singleton drove me to the Charleston airport after he set up traffic signs at the school stadium where he worked. All I took home was a sweatshirt and my Citadel Army jacket. And as we bucked traffic to the airport, we talked about seeing my family until Walt put me on the plane that would take me to New York. When I arrived at Kennedy Airport, my parents and brothers were there, and everybody looked the same except Ronnie had put on weight. He was as heavy as I was at 6 feet and 135 pounds. Hey, Turkey, I told him, wait till I wrestle you. My father drove the long way home so we would have time to talk since my parents were leaving when we got back to Montvale. They had planned a trip to Port Jervis for Eric's Mustang League games. The three of them would be away until sometime on Sunday. This was the night that Ronnie had been looking forward to. I didn't say much about college while riding home in the car, and when my parents asked questions, I answered, I'll tell you later on. Later, there wasn't much chance for this since I wasn't home a great deal. Finally, after the long way home, we got to Grand Avenue. Then as soon as we walked into the house and sat down at the kitchen table, my father gave me the shock of my life when he said, would you like a beer? You're 18 now, he added. You're the legal age. My mother had made a welcome home cake, and we talked till they left for Port Jervis. Then I went up to Mrs. Blair's house to take my Mustang from her garage and get started driving around. I was very happy to be back home, and I wanted to see everyone. Naturally, I looked for Steve first, and we made our plans for the night. Then I headed for Park Ridge to look for some of the people I knew and show them my uniform. My first stop was to Hennessy's to see Patty, Vicky, and their mother. Next, I went to Jeff Bickerton's, and when Jeff saw my uniform, he first thought I was a cop. We talked about cars a little while, and then we went out together. And after I stopped at my house to change to a pair of jeans. Later, I tried to see Vinny Trojan, but Vinny wasn't home, so I picked up Steve, and we drove around and stopped at the AMP. At the shopping center, I saw Jeff Fritz, who had never met Steve. Jeff asked what I'd be doing that night, and I said I'd be out with Steve. When I wasn't looking for someone on that first day home, I was in my room at the house listening to my stereo. Ronnie had moved back to his room, and he was there rolling dice. We rolled a couple together, and he said he was having a party that night since our parents were away. He also confided, look what I've got, and then he reached under his bed and pulled out a small green footlocker like you get with a G.I. Joe doll. This is where I keep my pot, he said, sounding pleased with himself. I took a look inside the box and saw the scales and rollers as well as several baggies that Ronnie had already emptied. You better be careful, I warned him, but I didn't say any more. Then later, when we took my car back to Mrs. Blair's garage for a good look at Ronnie's carpeting job and the other work he'd done, Ronnie brought out a plastic bag and offered me some pot. He acted proud to give it to me, and I said, well, okay. I'll always feel guilty for taking it and not speaking to Ronnie then, especially since I'd already seen from a close look at the carpet that Ronnie must have really been stoned while he was doing the work. I should have talked to him that day as soon as I saw what he had. And I should have said, cool it, Ronnie, before Dad catches you, but I was starting vacation, so I let it go for the moment. I wasn't with Ronnie very much during the rest of the week, and now I will always feel at fault that I was too busy to stop him from his involvement with drugs. Just saying he'd better cool it wasn't doing enough. When I went out that Saturday night, I drove around with Steve until we dropped back at the house around 9:30 or so. I wanted to show Steve something, and I wanted to check on Ronnie since I felt he had something up his sleeve, but I didn't know just what. As we pulled up to the side of the house, I heard the record blasting, and as soon as we walked inside the door, the place reeked of pot and beer. When Ronnie had mentioned earlier that he was having kids over, I thought it might be a party and that maybe he would have beer. But I didn't think he'd be stupid enough to allow pot in the house. If you get caught, I informed him, it will be your ass, not mine. You know your father's temper, Steve pointed out right away, and you know the threats that he has made if he ever caught you with drugs. You're asking for a blow-up if your father finds out. I don't mind the beer I put in, but you're not smoking pot in here. Anyone who's smoking pot has to get out right now. With that, the kids went out of the house and Ronnie went along, probably down to the railroad tracks where no one would bother them. Steve and I waited till everyone left, then we went out again. I'll never know if my parents smelled pot when they returned from Port Jarvis, but they didn't get home on Sunday in time to go to church. I was anxious to see Pastor Nielsen, so I drove down alone. A lot of people didn't know me in my Citadel uniform, and Ruth Mooring, an intern for the ministry, asked Pastor who I was. Later, she'd say she'd never forget me, but we didn't know that then. After church, I headed for Park Ridge to look for Vinnie Trojan, but he still wasn't home when I stopped by, so I went to visit the Hennessy's again before I returned to my house. When I finally got back, my parents were there, and the first thing my mother asked me was, "What do you want for dinner?" I immediately answered pizza, and we had it that Sunday night. I finally caught up with Vinnie Trojan on the following day when I picked him up at Park Ridge High. By then, I decided to fix up my Mustang so I would have it ready. Whether I drove to the Citadel just to pick up my things or whether I went back and stayed there. Without attending classes for the 2.5 week period until the Christmas vacation, I could always cash in my plane ticket, and just before Thanksgiving, I talked to an upperclassman who had said if I brought a car back, he'd put it under his name. I was thinking of this possibility most of the day on Monday, but I also had another thought as I talked to a guy on the weekend who had a station wagon he wanted to sell for $200. I'd thought of selling my Mustang occasionally in the past, but I couldn't get a good price for it in its present form. If I spend some money on it, though, I should get $1,200. Since I'd be leaving the Citadel at the latest by Christmas vacation, I figured if I could sell it for that, I'd spend $200 for the wagon and then use the rest of the money to set up some place to live. After that, I'd get a job and look for another school. Whatever I did, however, I had to fix up the Mustang, so I made up my mind I'd cash in my coins for the money I'd need for the car. When I picked up Vinny, I told him I had run out of money at school, so I needed to cash in my silver, which would go for a very good price. The coins that I cashed at a coin exchange were the ones in my own collection, though later, when Pop missed some of his, he accused me of ripping off silver from the collection he kept at our house. I cashed the check I got for the coins, $1,625.12, and I didn't tell my father because he'd ask why I sold them. As yet, I wasn't about to tell him that I was leaving school. By Tuesday, I started dropping small hints that I might drive to South Carolina, but my parents never picked up on this, so I don't know whether they got it. And I let it go at that. On Tuesday morning, my mother was mad when Jeff Fritz came to the house. Jeff, who can look like a hillbilly almost without even trying, had been to a party the previous night with one of his other buddies. The guy got really loaded, and he was feeling no pain when he and Jeff came to the door to see me the following day. My mother didn't think much of the pair because of the incident, so she did her best to discourage me from hanging around with Jeff. Jeff was really a good guy, though, so I thought to myself, he's my friend, and I'll do what I want to do. Later, the same evening, I went out with Steve and him, and the three of us went to Nanuet Shopping Mall, where we acted like three stooges. We were so crazy, we cracked ourselves up, and when I'd try to act serious, I'd say, I don't know you people. Eventually, in a grim moment and crucial time in my life, Steve and I would exchange a glance that said, Nanuet Mall. Before I went out in the evening, I drove around most of the day, and while I was waiting for Vinny to finish his afternoon classes, I ran into Jeff, D. Causemaker. I hadn't seen him since I'd been home. He was standing by a snack shop where the Park Ridge kids hung out, so the two of us spoke briefly till Vinny finished school. Then Vinny and I raced my Mustang along Spring Valley Road. I had a habit of taking that car up to its highest speed, then I'd put it into neutral and just coast along. Usually while I was coasting, I'd check in the rear mirror, and when I looked this Tuesday, I saw a cop's flashing lights. I'd never had any trouble with cops except for warnings on speeding. But this time I said to Vinny, uh-oh, he's going to get me. If I'd kept on going, he would have caught me, and he couldn't have seen my license. But I pulled over to the side, sure I was in for a ticket. I was lucky, however. It was a cop who knew me, and all he said was, all right, De La Roche, what's your excuse this time? He was in a very good mood, and all I got was a warning. Seeing the cop on Tuesday reminded me of the form I had for my rifle permit, and I meant to go down to the station and get my fingerprints. I got involved, however, and never got down with the form. On Wednesday, I spent the morning listening to my stereo and cleaning the .22 pistol from my father's bedside table. I was thinking of going shooting down at the rifle range, so my father said I could clean the pistol and load the clip with 10 shells. I put it back in the table drawer when I finished loading it, and as it turned out, the week went by and I didn't get down to the range. After school, I picked up Vinny again, and then we drove over to Pete Salerno's to find out about the dress uniform I'd left for him to bring home. I wanted it for Thanksgiving when my grandparents came to dinner. When we stopped at Pete's, he wasn't home, so we drove around for a while till I dropped off Vinny at his house and went back to mine to eat. I left again at 6 to return to Pete Salerno's. I found him home on this trip, but he told me as soon as I arrived that he'd forgotten the uniform when he left school in a hurry. My roommate forgot to tell me you dropped it off, he explained. And I was in and out of the room and didn't see it myself. I'll try to call him later tonight, and if by chance he brought it home, I'll let you know tomorrow. Then Pete asked what I'd be doing about returning to school, and I told him I'd be going back for the 2.5 weeks till Christmas. I stayed and talked about cars a while, and then I went to find Vinny. The two of us went to look for Jeff Fritz, and then we went out for the night. When my friends asked about the Citadel, I kept pretty quiet, and I usually tried to make it appear that I'd be going back. I often just said, it's okay, when people asked me about it, though I told certain people like Steve and some of the others some of the things that happened and how hard it really was. Steve and a few of the others knew I planned to pack it in, but even they weren't exactly sure whether I'd quit after getting my things or whether I'd stay till Christmas. I guess you couldn't expect them to know when I sometimes wavered myself. The big thing on Thanksgiving was the football games, and I stopped in first at Pascack Hills and next at the Park Ridge game. By the time I got home from the two games, Grandma and Pop were there, and we all sat down to dinner around the dining room table. The Abneaters asked lots of questions, but I kept making it clear that I didn't want to talk about school and would tell them about it later. By dessert, I was getting restless and anxious to get away, so I decided to drive around to see who I could find. No one was out, however, because it was Thanksgiving, so before too long I returned to the house, hoping Pete Salerno would call. I was beginning to feel uptight about the return to school, but each day it was harder to work myself up to talking to my parents about my future plans. I waited till 6 p.m. for Pete to call, then I put in a call to him. He'd just come home from a family dinner and hadn't phoned before because he'd learned that his roommate didn't have my uniform. I got more uptight than ever when I heard about this, and I think I said something silly like, my parents will be ready to kill me. Pete was upset and I was upset, so he tried to calm me down by saying he'd talk to my parents if I wanted them to. Forget it, I said, as I tried to hang up. But what's the big deal, he asked me. I really don't understand it, especially since you'll be returning to the Citadel on Sunday. Then he was silent before he asked, you are coming back to school, aren't you? I told him then that I wasn't sure, but he said he could still provide a ride if I let him know in time. I said okay and hung right up. I never saw Pete again. When I returned from the phone call, I told Mom and Dad that Pete had slipped up on bringing the uniform. Then, since the Eboneters were ready to leave, I arranged to visit them Friday and spend the night in Lodi. My parents still found excuses why they couldn't sleep over, so the next best thing was to sleep over there for an extra visit with them. On Friday, Vinny had a holiday, so we drove over to a tire place, and I bought new tires for the Mustang with money from the coins. I figured I would have them if I drove to South Carolina. And even though I'd be cutting it close, I knew that I could make it if I had left early Sunday and drove for 15 hours. I didn't want my father to see my brand new tires because he'd ask why I bought them and where I got the cash. I still wasn't ready to answer that and face the confrontation. On Friday, I went to Lodi in time to have supper there, and the Eboneters and I sat and talked until 11 or so. In the morning, I woke at 6 o'clock since I was accustomed to that, but I laid around till 10 or 11 thinking about the next day. When Grandma had breakfast ready, I got out of bed. A little later, my mother called to see when I'd be home. That was the only phone call I had at my grandmother's house, and when I said goodbye to her and promised to take care, neither of us knew at the moment what a long goodbye it would be. By the time I got back to Montvale, my parents were having lunch, so I sat at the kitchen table with them. Before I went back out, Ronnie wasn't at home at the time, and I didn't see Eric either. I tried to get in and out quickly, but my parents both mentioned returning to school, and I said I should get my things ready for the 1 p.m. flight on Sunday. I don't have much to get ready, I replied, just my sweatshirt and army jacket. Then before they could say any more, I got out of the door. The first thing I did when I left the house was to go see Freddie Kane, one of the kids from the Park Ridge gang, who had an apartment beneath his house that I knew nobody was using. I suggested the two of us set it up and then have me move in. I figured if I could arrange this, I could move out of the Montvale house when I came home for Christmas. We smoked a joint while we talked about this, and I suggested real hard that he go and ask his father if this would be all right. But Freddie answered no, not now. I tried to urge him to change his mind. When he wouldn't, I said, make it soon. My parents were planning to rake the leaves that Saturday afternoon, so I thought I'd go back and help a while if they wouldn't bring up school. They seemed to be in a very good mood and didn't ask any questions. After I'd done enough of the leaves, I decided to call it quits and drive around to say goodbye to some of the people I wouldn't see till I got home at Christmas. Just as I had the Saturday before, I dropped in at the Bickertons and also the Hennessy's. When I went to look for Jeff Bickerton, only his sister was home, so I stayed and talked to Allison for an hour or so. How's the Army? She asked me as soon as I got inside. It's the Citadel, not the Army, I declared, so I slouched down in the living room chair where I always felt so at home. Well, how's it going? She continued. It's hard, I said, with finality. Then I switched the subject to cars. Later, Allison had a date, so after we talked for a while, she went up to take a shower while I stayed and listened to records. When she came down, Jeff still wasn't home, so I said, I can't stay any longer, but tell Jeff I was here. Next, I went to the Hennessy's and I talked with Mrs. Hennessy while she took care of her baby and gave her a bath in the kitchen. I felt I could mention school to her, so I opened up a little and we discussed how everyone finds the first months pretty tough. They're always a rough adjustment, she said. You have to give it time. But if by Christmas you still don't like it, no law says you have to stay. You could work and save money and go to another school. There was still some time before supper, so I made a trip to Nanuet Shopping Mall and bought myself an expensive watch with some of the money that I had from the sale of the coins. I'd seen that watch at the Citadel and had fallen in love with it. In 24 hours, it would be gone. But for the brief time I had it, my $300 wristwatch was one of the nicest possessions I had ever owned. I stopped to buy cookies and brownies at a bakery on the way home, and just as I got back to the house, Dad and Eric were coming in with pizzas. Ronnie and Eric ate by the TV, and I sat down in the kitchen to eat with my mother and father. We talked of my plans for the evening, and I said I'd probably stay out late since this was my last free night. Little did I know how truthful that statement would turn out to be. I knew the time was getting short for talking about my plans, but still, I couldn't bring myself to say, I'm leaving the Citadel. There was always Sunday morning, maybe I should say it then. I also had in the back of my mind that if I was questioned at supper, I'd say, I'm still on vacation, I'll tell you about school at Christmas. I'll tell you everything then. I didn't have to say this, though, because I was able to get out of the house before any questions arose. There was never a confrontation about my leaving school, though newspaper reporters would later say my father and I had an argument about the Citadel. This was conjecture on their part every bit of the way, because in my week with my family, there was never a time that we ever discussed the big things on our minds. None of us knew what the others was thinking, and we left it at that. When I left the house after supper between 6:30 and 7 o'clock, Ronnie left in the Mustang with me to collect his paper money. I dropped him off in the center of town to collect at Nottingham Apartments. Then I made plans for the evening that, unbeknown to me, was going to be the last good evening I'd have for many a year. Steve was going to a party, and I had a chance to go too. But I really felt like driving around, so I headed to Jeff Fritz's house. It wasn't cold, but there was a fog, and before the evening was over, the fog would be so heavy you couldn't see 25 feet ahead. While I was driving to Jeff's house, my stick shift started to lock, so I stopped the car at a parking lot a few doors from where Jeff lived. The lot was crowded with cars and kids, since it was by a tavern, and while I was working on the shift, Vinny drove by with friends. While we talked, I put my new watch in my pocket so I wouldn't damage it. Then when I got the car fixed, or thought I had it fixed, I drove up the road to find Jeff. His sister Lisa, who was waiting for her date, came out to talk to me. Then Jeff and I got into my car and rode all over the place. We never drove very far, however, without the shift acting up. So we spent the first part of the evening trying to regulate that. I must have fixed it 20 times in only a matter of hours. I knew I was getting nowhere, though, so I finally said to Jeff, let's forget about it and go back from my mother's car. I'll meet you at 7-Eleven as soon as I change the car. Then I drove up to Mrs. Blair's, and after I parked in her garage, I walked down to my house. My parents were both in the living room when I went inside. My mother by the fireplace, my father on the couch. I sensed at once that they seemed upset, but they said I could have the car. I walked out through the kitchen, and I noticed on top of the dryer a clean t-shirt that said El Cid that my mother had washed and dried. I wanted to wear that earlier rather than the Citadel shirt, so I took off the Citadel right away and changed to the clean El Cid. Before I got any further, though, I heard my father's voice, and after he asked me a question, he told me something that, in its own way, contributed to changing my life. This added another problem to those I already had. Despite the problems, however, the evening was a good one, and Jeff and I went everywhere in my mother's car. We drove up to Rockland County and ate at a Burger King, and later took off for a parking lot where racing was often done. Since I'd put my watch in my pocket while I was fixing my car, I don't really know what time it was when we got home to Jeff's house. Jeff's sister's date had problems with the car he was driving that night, so Jeff and I followed him to his house and talked a while in his driveway. I didn't feel ready to go home myself while we were in the driveway, so I asked the two guys to stay out a while and drive back to Rockland County. They both said they wanted to call it a night, so after I dropped Jeff off, I wondered where I was going to go and who I could find around next. While deciding, I drove to the station where I'd worked and bought a soda and gas. There was nobody much at the station, though, so I headed for Rockland County and another burger spot. Then I drove to Maximus, a storefront bar and cocktail lounge, located in New City where I'd been just once before. The place was buzzing when I went in, and strobe lights were everywhere. I found myself a place at the bar and had 2 Michelobes while I listened to the records and watched the couples dance. When I noticed all the guys had sport shirts instead of t-shirts like mine, I kept my army jacket zipped so the El Cid wouldn't show. But the bartender saw my jacket and boots, so we started discussing the army. While we were talking, a black guy saw my army jacket too, and since he was going into the service, we talked while we sat at the bar. Later, the bartender would recall that I was sitting at the bar at approximately 1:30. He'd also state for the record that I wasn't intoxicated. After I moved to a table with the black dude, whose name was Steve, I didn't see the bartender again, but Steve and I must have sat and talked for the next half hour or so. Before the evening was over, we exchanged full names and addresses, but I didn't notice Steve's last name when I stuck the paper in my wallet. When I decided I'd better go home, I went to the men's room first, and while there I heard somebody say the time was a little after 2. I left Steve at the Maximus, and when I got outside, the fog had become more dense. It was so thick, I drove home slowly, 10 to 15 miles an hour. I drove on Route 304 for a while. Then, instead of continuing on the highway until I got to Montvale, I took the back way to Summit to Grand and down by Memorial School. I figured I'd go home by that route because if any guys were still out, I'd find them by going that way. I thought I have nothing better to do, so let's see who is out. Most of the time on my slow drive home, I'd been thinking about the next day and what I'd tell my parents just a few hours from now. By then, I'd planned to say Sunday, look, I'm driving back. But now I was in a new bind with the shift trouble on my car. Maybe if it got fixed early, I could still try to drive. And maybe the cops wouldn't bust me for speed when I had my uniform on. But even more disturbing was the new problem that I had after my talk with my father when I went home to change cars. This was very much on my mind as I parked my mother's car and made my way through the thickening fog to the steps leading to our side door. I noticed the light by the door was off, and this was very strange. And that's the end of chapter 5. And next time, I suppose it'll be the murder. And something tells me he's going to blame this black dude, Steve. But we'll see what happens. Goodbye, Ralph. Goodbye. Oh, put your bookmark there, fool. All right, Ralph. I'll do it. All right, bros. Goodbye. Good boy.